My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes and said, "We think it would be better if you didn't join us this year, Eleanor. The house will be too crowded, and frankly, your old stories bore everyone." Those words stung like winter frost, but they awakened something in me I thought had long disappeared: my spirit. That painful rejection became the catalyst for the most joyful holiday gathering I'd experienced in decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They say that family is who you're born to, but sometimes family is who you choose. This is the story of how I reclaimed my holiday, my dignity, and discovered that at 70 years old, I wasn't just someone's mother, grandmother, or widow. I was Eleanor Martin, and I still had so much to give. For 43 years, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in my home on Maple Avenue. Even after Harold passed away 6 years ago, I maintained our traditions. The antique dining table that belonged to my grandmother would groan under the weight of turkey, cranberry sauce, and my famous apple sage stuffing. The china Harold and I received as wedding gifts would be polished to a gleam, and everyone would gather. My son Michael, his wife Diane, their children, my sister Barbara and her family, cousins from Harold's side, and a few neighbors who had nowhere else to go. I was the matriarch, the keeper of traditions, the one who remembered everyone's favorite dishes and made sure the gravy never had lumps. Michael would always carve the turkey, just like his father taught him. The grandchildren would fight over who got to light the candles. My sister Barbara would bring her pecan pie, and we'd laugh about how she almost burned down her kitchen the first time she tried to make it. But things began to change 3 years ago when Michael got his promotion at the investment firm. Suddenly, they moved to Westlake Estates, one of those gated communities with fountains and security guards. Diane redecorated their new home in what she called modern minimalist style. Gone were the family heirlooms and comfortable furniture, replaced by stark white sofas and abstract art that looked to me like someone had spilled paint and called it a masterpiece. The first Thanksgiving after they moved, Diane suggested they host. "Your house is getting a bit small for everyone, Eleanor," she said, though my home had comfortably held our family for decades. I didn't argue. Change is part of life, I told myself. But when I arrived with my apple sage stuffing and Harold's carving set that had been in his family for generations, Diane intercepted me at the door. "Oh, we're not doing traditional Thanksgiving food this year," she announced. "Our caterer has prepared a Mediterranean-inspired menu, and we've hired a professional carver. Those old knives aren't really sanitary, are they?" I watched as my grandchildren ate olives and something called deconstructed turkey roulade, instead of the comfort food they'd grown up with. No one fought over lighting candles because there weren't any, just those flameless LED things that Diane said were safer. When I tried to tell my favorite story about how Harold once fought a snowstorm to get home for Thanksgiving, my grandson Jason whispered, "Mom says we've heard Grandma's stories 1,000,000 times." Last year was a little better. I was allowed to bring my stuffing, though Diane placed it on a side table rather than the main spread. Michael seemed distracted, barely speaking to anyone, constantly checking his phone. The grandchildren were glued to their devices, and when I asked about school, they gave one-word answers before returning to their screens. Eleanor looks out her kitchen window, expression thoughtful. Still, nothing prepared me for that phone. Call 3 weeks before this year's Thanksgiving. I was planning which ingredients to buy, fresh versus dried herbs, whether to try a heritage turkey this year, when my phone rang. "Mom, it's me," Michael said, his voice oddly formal. "Diane wants to talk to you about Thanksgiving." There was a shuffle, and then Diane's crisp voice came through. "Eleanor, we've been thinking about the holiday arrangements. The thing is, we're hosting some of Michael's colleagues from work, people who could really help his career. We need to make a good impression." "I understand, dear," I said. "Should I wear something special?" I have that blue dress from Barbara's daughter's wedding. Actually, Diane cut in, we think it would be better if you didn't join us this year, Eleanor. The house will be too crowded, and frankly, your old stories bore everyone. She paused, then added with false brightness, maybe you could have a nice quiet day at home. Watch the parade on TV? The silence stretched between us. I wanted to protest, to remind her that these holidays weren't just gatherings, but the threads that held our family's tapestry together. Instead, I heard myself say, I see. Well, you do what you think is best. Wonderful, Diane said, sounding relieved. I knew you'd understand. Oh, and the children will be quite busy with school activities, so maybe hold off on calling them for a bit. They're under so much pressure these days. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade to dusk. The house that had once bustled with life and laughter felt suddenly empty, hollow. Was this what the rest of my days would be? Quiet afternoons blending into silent evenings, waiting for phone calls that never came, gradually being erased from my own family's story? That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my living room until dawn, looking at the photographs that chronicled my life. Harold and I on our wedding day, Michael taking his first steps, family vacations, graduations, celebrations, a lifetime of love and sacrifice and joy. And now, at 70, I was being told I was no longer needed, no longer wanted. But as the first light of dawn crept through my curtains, something shifted inside me. A quiet voice that sounded remarkably like Harold's whispered, in my heart, Ellie, you've never been one to give up. Don't start now. I was born Eleanor Jean Campbell in the spring of 1953 in a small town called Millfield that most people have never heard of. My father owned the local hardware store, and my mother taught piano lessons from our front parlor. We weren't rich, by any measure, but we had what mattered, a home filled with music and laughter, hands that were never too busy to hold, and a table that always had room for one more. Eleanor, my mother used to say, the secret to a happy life is 3 things: work that fulfills you, love that sustains you, and a perfectly flaky pie crust. She'd laugh then, flour dusting her cheeks, but there was wisdom in her humor. I learned early that nurturing others was its own kind of strength. That creating spaces where people felt welcomed and valued was an art form as legitimate as any painting hanging in a museum. I met Harold Martin during my second year at community college. I was studying to be a teacher, and he was working on his business degree. We bumped into each other, quite literally, at the campus library. I was carrying a stack of books on early childhood education that towered above my line of sight, and Harold was rushing to return a business text before the library closed. The collision sent books flying across the polished floor, and as we scrambled to gather them, our hands touched over a copy of Economic Principles and Practices. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice soft despite his imposing height. His eyes were kind, deep brown with tiny flecks of gold, and when he smiled, a small dimple appeared in his left cheek. I'm Harold. Eleanor, I replied, feeling suddenly shy. But everyone calls me Ellie. That chance meeting blossomed into coffees at the campus cafe, long walks through the autumn leaves, and eventually, a diamond ring that Harold saved for 6 months to afford. It's not very big, he apologized as he slipped it onto my finger. But one day, I promise you'll have everything you deserve. I looked into those earnest eyes and knew with absolute certainty that I already had everything I could ever want. We married in the summer of 1974 in my parents' backyard. My mother strung fairy lights through the old oak tree, and my father built an arch of twisted branches where we exchanged our vows. My wedding dress was simple cotton lace that my grandmother had worn at her own wedding, carefully altered to fit my smaller frame. Harold wore a navy suit he'd bought for job interviews, a sprig of baby's breath in his lapel. We started our life together in a small apartment near the community college where I had taken a job as an administrative assistant while finishing my teaching degree. Harold worked at a local bank, putting in extra hours whenever he could. Our furniture was mostly secondhand: a wobbly dining table my father had repaired, a sofa with slightly worn armrests from Harold's aunt, mismatched chairs we'd painted, the same shade of blue to create some semblance of cohesion. Those early years were lean but sweet. We saved our pennies, cooking simple meals at home and finding joy in free pleasures: walks in the park, board games by candlelight when the electricity bill loomed large, picnics by the river on Sunday afternoons. When others our age were buying new cars or taking vacations, we put every extra dollar into our dream: a home of our own where we could raise a family. In 1977, we welcomed Michael into the world. I still remember the weight of him in my arms, so impossibly tiny yet somehow containing the entire universe. Harold stood beside the hospital bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "Look, what we made, Ellie," he whispered, voice choked with emotion. "Look at our son." Michael had Harold's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. From his earliest days, he showed a determination that both delighted and exhausted us. When he learned to walk, he refused any helping hand, tumbling again and again onto our carpeted floor, only to push himself up with renewed resolve. When he learned to read, he insisted on finishing entire books in one sitting, even as his small eyes grew heavy with sleep. "He's going to be something special," Harold would say proudly, watching Michael build elaborate structures with his wooden blocks or carefully count the change in his small piggy bank. "Our boy is going places." By the time Michael started school, Harold's career at the bank had advanced enough for us to make a down payment on a modest house on Maple Avenue. It wasn't grand: 3 bedrooms, a slightly outdated kitchen, a backyard that flooded after heavy rains, but to us it was a palace. I planted rose bushes along the front walkway and hung curtains I'd sewn myself in every window. Harold spent weekends repairing floorboards and painting walls, whistling as he worked. We filled that house with love, with plans, with the noise and chaos and joy of family life. I eventually secured a position teaching 2nd grade at Oakwood Elementary, just a few blocks from our home. The salary wasn't impressive, but the hours meant I could be home when Michael returned from school, and the summer breaks allowed us precious time together as a family. Harold continued climbing the ranks at the bank, moving from teller to loan officer to assistant manager. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had health insurance, a reliable car, and enough extra to start a college fund for Michael. Every summer, we took a modest vacation, a week at a lakeside cabin, camping in the state park, once even a trip to Disney World that we'd saved 3 years to afford. Michael would bounce with excitement for weeks beforehand, helping to pack the car and plotting our route on the road atlas with a highlighter. As Michael grew, I watched with a mixture of pride and wistfulness as he developed his own identity, separate from ours. The little boy who once followed Harold around the yard, mimicking his every move, became a teenager with opinions and interests all his own. He joined the debate team in high school, discovered a passion for economics, and set his sights on colleges with prestigious business programs. Just like his father, I'd say to Harold, watching Michael pore over finance textbooks at the kitchen table. Harold would shake his head, smiling. Smarter, though, and more ambitious. He won't stop at assistant manager of a small-town bank. There was no bitterness in Harold's voice when he said this, only pride and a deep, abiding hope that his son would have opportunities he never did. Harold had given up his own dreams of further education to support his younger siblings after his father's early death. He never spoke of it as a sacrifice, but I knew it was one of his few regrets. When Michael was accepted to Westmore University, with a partial scholarship, Harold and I hugged each other and cried after Michael went to bed. The scholarship would help, but we still faced 4 years of tuition payments that would strain our resources to the breaking point. Without hesitation, Harold took a second job working weekend security at the mall. I started tutoring after school, and selling homemade preserves at the farmer's market. "We'll manage," Harold assured me when I fretted over our thinning savings. "This is what we've been working for all these years." And we did manage, though it meant postponing home repairs, cutting back on everything non-essential, and working more hours than our bodies sometimes wanted to give. The day we drove Michael to college, helping him unpack his things in a dormitory room that seemed impossibly small for our tall, gangly son, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, pride and fear and loss and hope all tangled together in my heart. "Call us anytime," I told him, straightening his bedspread for the third time. "Day or night, and come home whenever you can." "I will, Mom," he promised, though I could see his eyes were already looking beyond us, toward the new life waiting. Just outside the door, Harold squeezed my hand as we walked back to the car. "He'll be fine, Ellie. We raised him right." Michael thrived at Westmore. His business acumen and natural charisma opened doors to internships, leadership positions in campus organizations, and a circle of friends from wealthy, well-connected families. When he came home for holidays, he spoke a new language of stock portfolios and market trends, startups and venture capital. His clothes became more expensive, his tastes more refined, his stories filled with names and places that seemed to belong to a world I could barely imagine. It was during his senior year that he brought Diane home for Thanksgiving. She was striking, tall, and slender with sleek blonde hair and clothes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. She studied international business and spoke 3 languages. Her father was a corporate attorney in Chicago, her mother a dermatologist with her own practice. Next to her, I felt suddenly conscious of my sensible shoes and the laugh lines around my eyes. "Your home is so quaint," she said, looking around our living room with its comfortable but worn furniture, the family photos on every surface, the hand-crocheted afghan draped over the sofa. "It's like stepping into another time." I wasn't sure if it was a compliment, but I chose to take it as one. "Harold and I believe a home should be lived in, not just looked at," I replied, offering her more mashed potatoes. "Diane's family just renovated their lake house," Michael said quickly. "It was featured in Architectural Digest." "How lovely," I said, though I'd never heard of the magazine. "I'd love to see photos sometime." Throughout the meal, I watched my son, the way he looked at Diane, the way he seemed to hang on her every word, the way he subtly corrected his grammar and table manners in her presence. It wasn't that I disliked her. She was polite, intelligent, clearly ambitious, but I couldn't help feeling that when Michael looked at her, he saw a future that had no place for his past. After they left, Harold found me in the kitchen, washing dishes with more vigor than necessary. "She seems nice," he offered, picking up a dish towel. "She's perfect," I said, scrubbing at a stubborn spot on the roasting pan. "Beautiful, educated, sophisticated, everything I'm not." Harold set down the towel and turned me to face him, his hands gentle on my shoulders. "Ellie, Martin, you stop that right now. You are the most beautiful, intelligent, loving woman I've ever known. If our son is lucky, Diane will have half your character." I leaned into his solid warmth, grateful beyond words for this man who had stood beside me for so many years, who still looked at me as if I were the young girl he'd met in the library, even as time etched its marks on both our faces. Michael and Diane married 2 years later in a lavish ceremony at a historic mansion that Diane's parents rented for the occasion. The guest list included partners from Michael's investment firm, Diane's sorority sisters, and various connections from both their professional networks. Harold and I sat in the front row, feeling somewhat out of place amid the designer suits and cocktail dresses. "Just smile and be yourself," Harold whispered, adjusting his tie for the dozenth time. "We're the parents of the groom. We have every right to be here." The ceremony was beautiful, but impersonal, with none of the warmth or character that had marked our backyard wedding all those years ago. I missed the personal touches, the sense of family and community. But Michael looked happy, And in the end, that was all that mattered. As the years passed, Michael and Diane built their life together, climbing steadily upward in both their careers. They bought a sleek condominium in the downtown area, then upgraded to a larger home in an exclusive neighborhood when Michael received a significant promotion. They traveled extensively, ski trips to Aspen, anniversaries in Paris, business conferences in Tokyo. I followed their lives with interest and pride, though increasingly from a distance. Our phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. Visits became annual events rather than regular occurrences. When they did come to see us, it was often a brief stopover on the way to somewhere else, conversations punctuated by the chiming of cell phones and glances at watches. "They're busy, Ellie," Harold would remind me when I expressed hurt at a canceled visit or forgotten birthday. "Building careers takes time and focus. Remember how hard we worked at their age?" "We always made time for family," I would counter. But I tried not to dwell on it. After all, wasn't this what we'd wanted for Michael? Success, security, opportunities beyond what we could have provided? In 2015, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Sophia. I knitted her a soft yellow blanket and a matching hat, spending hours ensuring every stitch was perfect. When we visited the hospital, Diane looked remarkably composed for someone who had just given birth, her hair arranged artfully on the pillow, a silk robe replacing the standard hospital gown. "Would you like to hold her?" Michael asked, carefully transferring the tiny bundle into my arms. The moment I looked into Sophia's face, so small, so perfect, with Harold's dimple already visible in her cheek, all my accumulated disappointments melted away. Here was a fresh start, a new chapter, a chance to rebuild the connections that had frayed over time. 2 years later, they had a son, Lucas. Our grandchildren became the center of our world. I made photo albums documenting their growth, saved for special gifts, planned outings and activities for when they visited. Harold built a treehouse in our backyard and stocked up on toys and books to keep at our house. For a few golden years, it felt like we had reclaimed something precious. Michael and Diane were too busy with their careers to manage all the demands of parenthood without help, so they welcomed our involvement. I picked up Sophia from preschool 3 days a week. Harold taught Lucas to ride a bike in our driveway. During school breaks, the children would stay with us, filling our home once again with laughter and sticky fingerprints and the wonderful chaos of young lives. Then came the winter of 2019, and with it, the diagnosis that would change everything. Harold had been feeling tired for months, brushing off my concerns with reassurances about work stress and age catching up with him. When he finally agreed to see a doctor, the news was devastating. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer already spread to his liver. The prognosis was 6 months, perhaps a year with aggressive treatment. "It's not fair," I wept in Michael's arms when we called to tell him. "We were supposed to have more time." "We'll get through this, Mom," he promised, his voice steady, though I could hear the fear beneath it. "The firm has excellent medical coverage. We'll find the best specialists, explore every treatment option." True to his word, Michael arranged consultations with top oncologists, researched clinical trials, even investigated experimental treatments overseas. For a few months, I allowed myself to hope. But Harold's decline was swift and merciless. The chemotherapy ravaged his once strong body, leaving him frail and exhausted. The pain medications fogged his sharp mind. Through it all, he remained my Harold, gentle, thoughtful, more concerned with my welfare than his own. "Promise me you'll still find joy, Ellie," he made me swear one night, his hand gripping mine, with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't stop living when I'm gone." I made the promise, though I couldn't imagine how I would keep it. Harold passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in April 2020, with me beside him holding his hand. He slipped away peacefully, the weight of suffering finally lifted from his shoulders. I felt his absence like a physical thing, a hollow space in the bed beside me, an echo in rooms that had once rung with his laughter, a shadow where his substance should have been. The world was already changing then, with the pandemic forcing everyone into isolation. My grief unfolded in a strange limbo, without the usual rituals and gatherings that might have provided some comfort. The funeral was small, socially distanced, nothing like the celebration of life that Harold deserved. Michael flew in for 3 days, staying at a hotel rather than at the house, citing concerns about my age and vulnerability. Diane and the children remained in their gated community, sending flowers and a professionally designed memorial video. Understood the precautions, of course. But understanding didn't ease the loneliness of those first months without Harold. I wandered our house like a ghost, touching his things, wearing his sweaters, sometimes talking to him as if he might answer. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Gradually, painfully, I found ways to keep moving forward. I volunteered to deliver meals to homebound seniors even more isolated than myself. I joined a virtual grief support group where I found comfort in the shared experiences of others who understood the particular ache of losing a lifelong partner. I planted a garden in Harold's memory, filling it with all his favorite flowers: black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, bright zinnias, that bloomed from early summer until the first frost. As the world slowly reopened, I established new routines. Tuesday mornings at the community center for watercolor class, Thursday afternoons volunteering at the elementary school's reading program, Sunday dinners with my sister Barbara and her husband, who lived across town. I made new friends, Gloria from my painting class, whose forthright humor reminded me of my mother, Raymond, a retired English professor who shared my love of mystery novels, Louisa and her wife Carmen, who ran the community garden and taught me how to compost properly. The hole in my heart where Harold had been would never completely heal, but I was learning to live around it, to carry my grief as part of me rather than allowing it to consume me. I was keeping my promise to him, one day at a time. Michael and his family remained distant, though we spoke on video calls every few weeks. The children were growing so quickly, developing interests and personalities that I glimpsed only in fragments: Sophia's emerging talent for mathematics, Lucas's obsession with space exploration. I sent birthday gifts and holiday packages, carefully chosen books and handmade items that I hoped would convey the love I couldn't deliver in person. When the invitation came to spend Christmas with them in 2021, I was overjoyed. It would be my first holiday without Harold, and the thought of spending it with family rather than alone was a gift beyond measure. I prepared for weeks, shopping for presents, baking Harold's famous gingerbread cookies from his grandmother's recipe, even buying a new dress for the occasion. The visit was not what I had hoped. Their home, while undeniably beautiful, felt like a showplace rather than a home. The children's toys were confined to a specially designated playroom. The kitchen gleamed with appliances that were never used. They had a private chef prepare most meals, and conversation revolved around investments, property values, and the achievements of people I'd never met. "Grandma, why don't you have a cleaning service?" Sophia asked one afternoon, watching me wash dishes by hand after lunch. "Mom says it's inefficient to do housework yourself when your time could be better spent on personal development." "I find washing dishes rather meditative," I replied, smiling at my granddaughter's serious expression. "And it gives me time to think about nice memories, like when your dad was little and would help me dry the plates." "Dad did chores?" Lucas looked up from his tablet with genuine surprise. "Oh yes," I laughed. "He was my best little helper. He used to stand on a stool right about where you're sitting now." For a moment, a connection flickered between us. A shared image of Michael as a small boy, so different from the polished executive they knew. Then Diane called the children to their scheduled tennis lesson, and the moment dissolved. That evening, as Michael and Diane entertained business associates in their formal dining room, I sat alone in my guest room, missing Harold with an intensity that took my breath away. "I'm trying," I whispered to his memory. "I'm trying to find my place in their world, but I'm not sure there is one." I returned home with a mixture of gratitude and relief. The visit had confirmed what I already suspected. Michael's life had moved in a direction that had little room for the values and traditions that had shaped our family. It wasn't that he didn't love me. It was that he had constructed a narrative of success that required distancing himself from his modest beginnings. In the years that followed, our contact continued to dwindle. Video calls became voice calls, which became text messages and occasional emails. The grandchildren's visits, once highlights of my summer, were replaced by camp sessions and educational travel programs. When I suggested coming to stay with them for a week, there was always some reason it wasn't convenient. Renovations, business trips, the children's packed schedules. I filled my days with meaningful activities and cultivated deeper relationships with friends who had become like family. I took classes at the community college, discovering a talent for ceramics that surprised and delighted me. I traveled a little, a week in New Mexico with Barbara, a guided tour of the Canadian Rockies with my watercolor group, a Caribbean cruise, with Gloria and some other friends from the senior center. It wasn't the life I had imagined for my 70th year, but it was rich and full in its own way. I missed Harold every day, but I also found joy in the independence I'd never expected to have. I painted my bedroom a bold teal color that Harold would have found too dramatic. I adopted a cat from the shelter, despite having always been dog. People during our marriage. I rearranged furniture on a whim and ate ice cream for breakfast occasionally because there was no one to tell me I shouldn't. Still, when holidays approached, the absence of family felt especially acute. I had created new traditions, Thanksgiving potluck with my grief support group, Christmas Eve dinner with Barbara and her growing brood of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but there remained a Michael-shaped hole in these gatherings, a space where my son and his children should have been. So when the phone rang 3 weeks before Thanksgiving this year, and I saw Michael's name on the caller ID, my heart lifted with hope. Perhaps this year would be different. Perhaps, finally, we would find our way back to each other across the gulf that had widened between us. I had no way of knowing that this call would not be an invitation, but a rejection. Not a bridge, but a final severing of the ties I had clung to so stubbornly. I had no way of knowing that Diane's cold words, "We think it would be better if you didn't join us this year, Eleanor," would send me spiraling first into despair, then into anger, and finally into a revelation that would change everything. My daily routine had taken on a comfortable rhythm in the years since Harold's passing. Each morning, I woke with the sun, a habit formed over decades that not even widowhood could break. My cat, Fitzgerald, Fitz for short, usually announced the dawn with gentle paws on my face, his internal clock even more reliable than mine. I'd named him after F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose books Harold and I had read aloud to each other during the early years of our marriage. "Good morning, handsome," I'd murmur, scratching behind his ears before swinging my legs over the side of the bed. My first steps were always a bit stiff. Arthritis had taken up residence in my knees and hips, an unwelcome tenant I'd learned to accommodate. The house on Maple Avenue was quiet in the mornings, sunlight filtering through the curtains Harold and I had chosen together decades ago. Though I'd changed many things since his passing, those curtains remained. Their floral pattern faded, but still cheerful. Some connections to the past were too precious to relinquish. My morning routine was simple but deliberate. A hot shower to ease the night's stiffness. Comfortable clothes, usually slacks and a sweater or a casual dress when the weather permitted. A dab of tinted moisturizer, a swipe of lipstick, and a quick brush through my silver hair. Harold had always said he loved watching my hair change over the years, from chestnut brown to salt and pepper, to finally this luminous silver. Like watching the seasons change on my favorite landscape, he'd say, running his fingers through it. Breakfast was always at the small kitchen table by the window, where I could watch birds visiting the feeders Harold had hung years ago. I maintained them faithfully, filling them with different seeds depending on the season. The cardinals were my favorites, their brilliant red plumage like tiny flames against the backdrop of our oak tree. Harold had loved the chickadees, admiring their plucky nature and constant activity. "Just like you, Ellie," he'd say. "Small but mighty, and always busy." After breakfast came my morning walk, weather permitting. 3 blocks down Maple Avenue, a right turn onto Elm Street, then a loop through Riverside Park before heading home. The same route Harold and I had walked thousands of times together, though now I covered it at a more measured pace. The neighbors along my route had changed over the decades, young families replacing elderly couples, houses being renovated or expanded, but many still greeted me by name. "Morning, Mrs. Martin," Tom Chen would call from his driveway, where he was usually loading his children into the car for school. His parents had been among our first friends when we moved to Maple Avenue, and though they had long since retired to Arizona, Tom had bought the house next door to keep it in the family. "Beautiful day, Eleanor," Mrs. Abernathy would remark from her garden, where she tended roses that rivaled my own. At 82, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her green thumb remained legendary in the neighborhood. These small interactions anchored me to my community, reminded me that I belonged somewhere, even as my immediate family drifted further away. I treasured them more than the neighbors could possibly know. The remainder of my mornings varied depending on the day. Mondays were for errands, grocery shopping at Wilson's Market, where Dan Wilson still remembered how Harold liked his steaks cut, though Harold had been gone for years. Banking at First Community, where I'd worked briefly as a teller before Michael was born. Picking up prescriptions at Patterson's Pharmacy, where Gloria often met me for coffee in their small cafe. Tuesdays belonged to my watercolor class at the community center. I'd discovered a passion for painting that surprised me, having never considered myself particularly artistic. My work wasn't remarkable. Simple landscapes, still lifes of flowers. From my garden, occasional portraits of Fitz in his various lounging positions, but the process brought me peace. The careful observation required to capture light and shadow, the meditative quality of brush-meeting paper, the gentle community of fellow painters who gathered each week to share techniques and encouragement. Raymond, our instructor, had the patience of a saint and the eye of a master. "You're getting better, Eleanor," he'd say, studying my work with genuine interest. "Your colors are becoming more confident." High praise from a man who'd once exhibited in galleries in New York. Wednesdays, I volunteered at Oakwood Elementary, the same school where I'd once taught, though the building had been renovated beyond recognition. I read to first graders, their wide eyes and eager questions reminding me why I'd love teaching. Children have a way of keeping you present, anchoring you to the moment with their boundless curiosity and spontaneous affection. "Mrs. Martin, why does your hair shine like a star?" 6-year-old Amara had asked recently, patting my head with solemn wonder. "Because I'm magical," I'd whispered, making her giggle with delight. Thursdays were for my ceramics class at the community college, a newer addition to my routine. I'd started just 6 months earlier, encouraged by Barbara, who insisted I needed to get my hands dirty more often. She wasn't wrong. There was something profoundly satisfying about coaxing formless clay into bowls and mugs and small sculptures. My creations were imperfect, often lopsided or sporting unintentional dents. But I loved them anyway. They reminded me that beauty doesn't require perfection. Fridays I met with my grief support group, though grief no longer accurately described our purpose. We'd evolved into something more like a friendship circle, the shared experience of loss creating bonds that transcended our differences. We were 5 women and 2 men, ranging in age from 62 to 81, from different backgrounds and faiths, united by the experience of learning to live alone after decades of partnership.